I did not know, the morning I found Wyatt Calloway standing on the wrong side of my fence line, that I would spend the rest of that year deciding between two brothers who wanted entirely different things from me. One wanted my water, and I would not understand what the other one wanted until it was almost too late to say so. My father had been dead 8 months by then, and I had spent every one of them learning exactly how much a woman alone was expected to give up simply to keep the things she'd been left. The ridge itself ran along the boundary between our two claims, a long spine of red rock and scrub oak with the creek cutting down through it in a narrow channel my father had spent 2 summers coaxing into a proper ditch, and from the high point of it, a person could see clear across both properties at once. My 160 acres of dry grass and half-built fence, and beyond it, the considerably larger spread the Calloway family had built up over 3 generations. Cattle scattered dark against pale grass all the way to the foothills. I had taken to walking that ridge most evenings since the funeral, not for any particular purpose, except that it was the one place on the whole claim where I could stand and see the entire shape of what I was responsible for keeping. And some evenings the size of that responsibility sat on me heavier than any grief I had left to spend on my father specifically. The land itself was the easy part to explain. My father had filed his claim under the Homestead Act the same spring I turned 16. 160 acres along the ridge the Calloways had taken to calling theirs, though the government's map still called it ours, and he had broken sod and built fence and dug the first stretch of irrigation ditch himself before his heart gave out in a February so cold the ground took 3 men and a full day to open for burying him. He had 18 months left before the claim would be fully proved. The 5 years the law required a man to live on and improve his land before it became truly his, and I was the one left to finish proving it, which the land office clerk in town informed me, not unkindly, was a considerably harder thing for a woman to accomplish alone than the law technically admitted. I still kept his boots by the door that first winter, worn soft at the heel in the particular shape of a man who had walked the same ditch line 10,000 times, and some mornings I found myself talking to them the way a person talks to an empty chair at a table, asking a dead man's opinion on questions he had never lived long enough to answer for me. He had taught me to read a headgate's mechanism before he'd taught me much else about the claim, patient in a way that surprised the neighbors, who assumed a man raising a daughter alone on a homestead would teach her cooking and leave the water to whichever husband eventually arrived to inherit both her and the ditch. My father had never once mentioned a husband as part of the arrangement. I had not fully understood, until Daniel Calloway began circling the subject so carefully that spring, how unusual that omission had actually been. Daniel Calloway understood the arithmetic of my situation better than I did myself, and he began visiting within a month of the funeral with a courtship so practical it took me longer than it should have to recognize it as courtship at all. He brought seed in the spring and helped me set fence in the fall. And every visit circled eventually back to the same subject, gently but unmistakably, the way a man circles back to something he has already decided is inevitable. The ditch that ran the water down off the ridge crossed both our properties, and the water law in that territory did not care whose name was on a deed so much as whose hands had put the water to use first. A principle folks were already calling prior appropriation years before the territory would write it plain into its own constitution. My father had dug first. That fact alone made my small allotment of water worth more to the Calloway ranch, struggling as it was, than my 160 acres of dry grass ever would be on their own. It isn't only the water, Daniel told me once, standing in my kitchen with his hat in his hands and ink still faintly staining the side of his right fingers from the ledgers he kept late into every night trying to make the ranch's numbers behave. I believed he half meant it. I had also learned, watching him do the sums on my father's fence posts and my father's ditch with the same careful attention he gave his own herd counts, that a man could genuinely care for a woman and still be unable to fully separate that caring from what her land could do for him, and that the two things braided together so tightly in a man like Daniel that he likely couldn't have pulled them apart himself if I had asked him to try. He was not. I want to be fair in saying a cruel man or even an especially calculating one by nature. He brought me a jar of his own mother's plum preserves that same visit, apologizing for the ledger stains on his hands before I had even noticed them. and asked after my father's grave with a gentleness that seemed entirely unrehearsed. It was only later, turning the visit over the way I turned over most of Daniel's visits, that I noticed how neatly the plum preserves and the grave question and the water talk had all been folded into a single hour, as though even his kindness arrived pre-sorted into columns, each one doing a little quiet work toward the same eventual total. I had been asked before, in a manner of speaking. 2 years earlier, back before my father's health began failing, a young man named Corliss had courted me for the better part of a season with every appearance of real affection, riding out most Sundays with wildflowers he'd picked along the road, and a way of listening to me talk about the claim that had, at the time, felt like genuine interest rather than reconnaissance. He had asked my father, that autumn, what portion of the homestead he might expect to inherit through marriage, and my father had told him plainly that the whole claim would pass to me outright regardless of who I married, because he had raised me to hold land, not merely to carry it toward whichever man arrived to collect it. Corliss stopped riding out within the month. I had told myself since then that I would know the difference next time between a man who wanted me and a man who wanted what I came attached to. Watching Daniel Calloway do sums in my kitchen, I was no longer entirely certain I could tell the two apart at all, and that uncertainty sat in me like a stone I couldn't quite swallow. Word reached town in early June that Wyatt Calloway was riding back into the territory after 6 years away, and I heard the fullest version of it standing at the counter of the general store, where two of the older ranch wives had positioned themselves for exactly this purpose, embellishing a story they'd clearly already told several times that morning. "You'd think the man rode off to fight a war instead of just riding off," the elder of the two said, loud enough for the benefit of anyone else at the counter, while the storekeeper weighed out my flour with the particular slowness of a man pretending not to listen. Her companion allowed that Wyatt had always been the handsomer of the two brothers, which she said the way a person says something faintly disreputable, and then both women turned their attention to me directly, clearly hoping for some fresh material regarding the Calloway situation to carry home with their own purchases. I told them only that I had not yet met the man, which was true at the time I said it, and left the store with my flour and considerably more curiosity about Wyatt Calloway than I had walked in with, which I suspected had been the exact effect those two women intended to produce in anyone who would listen. He had left, they said, after a hard falling out with his father over the old man's plan to marry him off to a rancher's daughter 3 counties over for the sake of her family's grazing leases, and he had ridden out rather than be sold, as he'd apparently put it once to Daniel before leaving, like a piece of the herd. Their father had died the following winter, alone with Daniel to bury him and inherit both the ranch and its debts, and Wyatt had not come back for the funeral, which the town had not forgiven him for even 6 years later, though nobody seemed to know what exactly Wyatt owed the town in the first place. I found him myself on the wrong side of my own fence line on a hot morning in June, crouched beside the headgate that controlled how much creek water turned down my ditch instead of continuing on toward Calloway land, studying the mechanism with the particular stillness of a man reacquainting himself with something he used to understand better than anyone. He had his brother's same dark hair, though his was cut close and combed back rather than left loose, and the same deep-set eyes, though his had gone a shade more guarded with whatever 6 years of drifting had taught him. "This gate's been reset since I left," he said, by way of greeting, not quite an apology for trespassing and not quite anything else either. Wanted to see whose hand had been at it. I told him it had been mine, and my father's before that, and he looked at the gate a long moment more before he looked at me, and something in his face shifted the way a man's face shifts when he's revising an assumption in real time. He told me, over the following weeks, pieces of why he'd left that Daniel had never once mentioned in all his visits. Their father had run that ranch the way he'd run everything, Wyatt said, as a ledger to be balanced by whatever means necessary. And when the old man had decided Wyatt's marriage was simply another entry to be arranged for the sake of grazing leases, Wyatt had understood all at once that staying would mean spending the rest of his life as a line item in someone else's accounting. He had not expected, leaving, that the weight of the ranch would land entirely on Daniel instead, 6 years younger and considerably less prepared to carry it alone. "I didn't leave him a choice about staying," Wyatt said, The first time he said anything that sounded like an apology, though it wasn't addressed to me. Man doesn't get to complain about his brother's arithmetic when he's the one who left him holding all the numbers. It was Wyatt, oddly, who remembered me from before he'd left. Though I had been barely 14 the last summer he'd lived on that ranch, and he had been a grown man of 26 already restless under his father's arithmetic. He recalled, he told me one evening, that I had once ridden over with my own father to help settle an argument about the ridgeline, and that I had sat on the fence the entire afternoon reading a book while the two fathers argued, entirely unbothered by the tension around me, and that he had thought at the time that a girl who could read straight through a boundary dispute without once looking up was probably going to turn out considerably more sensible than either man doing the arguing. "Didn't expect to ride back 6 years later and find you'd proved that theory right," he said, settling the exact same argument they never finished. I told him I didn't remember the book, but I remembered the fence, and the particular satisfaction of ignoring two grown men shouting about a ditch that neither of them had dug themselves. He told me a little, that same week, about where the 6 years had actually taken him, a season breaking horses in the Texas Panhandle, 2 winters working a line camp in Montana territory cold enough to freeze a man's breath to his own collar, a stretch of months he didn't elaborate on much beyond saying he'd spent them mostly alone, which I understood by then to be Wyatt's particular way of describing anything that had cost him more than he cared to itemize. He said he'd written Daniel exactly 4 letters in 6 years, each one shorter than the last, because he hadn't known how to explain leaving without sounding either cruel or cowardly. And eventually silence had seemed like the more honest option of the two, though he no longer believed that had been true. "Man convinces himself silence is mercy," he said, when mostly it's just the coward's version of the same arithmetic he rode off to escape. I asked him why he'd finally come back after so long. He considered the question longer than seemed necessary for so simple a thing. Heard our father had died the winter after I left, and told myself for years I had good reasons not to come back for that either. Wasn't until this spring I ran out of reasons that still sounded true when I said them out loud to myself. The headgate needed real repair by the middle of July. The wooden gears worn enough that the water was running unpredictable through my ditch, threatening either to flood my lower field or starve it dry depending on which way the mechanism decided to stick on a given morning. And Wyatt showed up at first light 3 days running to help me rebuild it properly, without being asked, and without once mentioning the water rights his own brother had spent 2 months carefully circling. We worked with our hands in Cold Creek mud past the wrist, replacing rotted gears with ones he'd carved himself from seasoned oak the previous evening. And I remember the particular ache of that labor, the smell of wet earth and cut wood, the way his forearms corded with effort in a manner that had nothing performative in it at all. Only usefulness offered plainly and without accounting. He whittled the second morning's gear teeth by the light of my kitchen lamp the night before, he told me later, because he hadn't trusted his own carving in the poor evening light out at the shack he was staying in, and something about a grown man admitting that carefulness so plainly, without embarrassment, struck me as considerably more disarming than any of Daniel's practiced gentleness had managed. It was on the 3rd morning, both of us soaked to the elbow and laughing, for the first time since my father's death, at something so small I no longer remember what it was, that I understood I had stopped thinking of Wyatt Calloway as Daniel's brother and started thinking of him as something considerably harder to categorize. He must have understood something similar in that same moment, because the laughter between us went quiet all at once, and he was looking at me with an expression I recognized from nowhere in particular, except perhaps my own reflection. And he had gotten as far as saying my name, just my name, nothing after it yet, when Daniel's voice carried down from the ridge road asking whether we'd gotten the gate sorted, and whatever Wyatt had been about to say folded itself back down into silence before I ever got to hear the rest of it. Daniel came to see me alone the following week, and this visit carried none of the easy practicality of the ones before it. He had learned, he said, that the boundary agreement our fathers had signed 15 years earlier, the one establishing whose ditch crossed whose land, and under what terms, had never been properly filed with the county, a clerical oversight nobody had thought to correct while both fathers were alive to vouch for the arrangement by handshake alone. Without that filing, Daniel explained, careful and precise the way he was careful and precise about everything. The water law's plain principle of first use could be argued to favor whoever filed a competing claim, first now, this year, regardless of whose ditch had run the water for 15 years prior. He was not threatening me, he said. He wanted me to understand, plainly, that filing such a claim himself was a thing he could do, and that marrying me was the only arrangement he could think of that would settle the matter permanently, for both of us, without either family losing what mattered most to them. His voice shook slightly on the word permanently, the first crack I had ever heard in his careful arithmetic, though I was too unsettled in that moment to wonder what had caused it. I did not sleep well after that visit. I turned the conversation over through the night, the way a person turns over a coin looking for the flaw in it. And somewhere past midnight I found myself talking to my father's boots again, asking him plainly what he would have wanted, and hearing, in the particular silence that followed, nothing that resembled an answer at all. I thought of the specific way he used to test a fence post before trusting his weight to it, pushing twice, hard, before ever leaning on the thing. And I understood, lying awake, that I had never once tested Daniel's proposal the same careful way, only absorbed it the way a person absorbs weather, as something to be endured rather than examined. By morning I had convinced myself, almost, that Daniel's proposal was simply the practical shape decency took in a hard country. That a marriage built on solving a water dispute honestly might still grow into something real, the way plenty of marriages in that territory had grown from less promising ground than that. I thought of the 18 months still standing between me and a fully proved claim, and the particular exhaustion of fighting alone for something the law had never quite trusted a woman to hold on to unassisted. And I thought, with a kind of grim practicality that frightened me more than Daniel's proposal had, that perhaps practicality was simply what I owed my father's memory now. It was only toward dawn, watching the gray light come up over the ridge through my kitchen window, that I let myself admit the thought I had been avoiding all night, that practicality had never once, in my entire life, felt like this particular kind of dread, and that a decision which frightened a person this thoroughly was rarely, in my experience, the honest one. It was Wyatt who found out about the filing threat, not from me, but from Daniel himself, in a conversation between the two brothers that I did not witness but heard about afterward from both sides, each account colored by its own particular grief. Wyatt rode to my homestead that same evening with a fury in him I had not seen before, quiet the way his stillness at the headgate had been quiet, but entirely different underneath it. "He's doing exactly what our father did," Wyatt said, "just with paperwork instead of a marriage broker 3 counties over. Making a ledger entry out of a person and calling it practical because the alternative requires admitting he's afraid." I asked him afraid of what. Wyatt was quiet a long moment before he answered. Afraid the ranch fails on his watch the way it never failed on our father's, and afraid that if he loses the ranch, there's nothing left underneath it that makes him worth anything to anybody. I know that fear better than I like admitting. I rode 6 years to get away from becoming it, and I still nearly let him drag me straight back into arguing his arithmetic instead of yours. He told me, too, what he had actually said to Daniel that evening, sitting in the ranch house kitchen where the two of them had argued as boys and were apparently still arguing as men. He had told Daniel plainly that their father had never once, in 30 years of running that ranch, been made happier by any deal he'd struck, only steadier, and that steadiness bought at the cost of another person's choosing was not the inheritance either of them ought to want to carry forward. Daniel had asked him, Wyatt said, what exactly he expected him to do instead. Watch the ranch fail for lack of water, while some far-off court sorted out a filing question that could take years to resolve. Wyatt hadn't had a good answer for that in the moment, he admitted to me. He had only known with total certainty that marrying me for the water was the wrong answer, even if he couldn't yet see clearly what the right one was. I confronted Daniel myself 2 days later. Not with anger, because I did not think anger would reach whatever was actually driving him, but with the same plain directness he had always used with me. I told him I understood now what the water meant to the ranch, and what the ranch meant to him, and that I did not think either of those things was small or unworthy of his fear. But I told him, too, that I had spent 2 years learning the difference between a man who wanted me and a man who wanted what came with me, and that I would not spend the rest of my life as the solution to an accounting problem, however kindly he dressed the arithmetic. Daniel did not argue the point. He stood in my kitchen a long while, turning his hat in his hands the way his brother had turned it at the headgate, and when he finally spoke, his voice had none of its usual careful precision in it at all. "I have been so frightened of failing this ranch," he said, "that I forgot to notice I was about to fail at being a decent man to get it. I don't know how to fix the water. I only know how to fix the shame of asking properly this time. If you'll let me start over on those terms instead." We worked it out over the following month, the way the territory's older ranches had learned to work out such things long before any court got involved. A mutual ditch agreement, drawn up plain and filed properly this time with both our names on it, splitting the water by the same measure our fathers had always intended, formalized now in ink instead of handshake, so that no accounting confusion could ever threaten either of our claims again. The land office clerk who filed it for us remarked, not unkindly, that it was the tidiest ditch agreement he'd processed all year, which Daniel seemed to take as its own small vindication. He signed his name to it with something that looked almost like relief, as though the actual solution, once he stopped needing marriage to deliver it, had been simpler and more honest than the fear that had been driving him toward me in the first place. I remembered, watching him sign, that Daniel had been at the fence that same childhood afternoon too. Younger than Wyatt by 6 years and too small then to do anything but trail after his older brother asking questions nobody answered. And I thought there was something almost fitting in the fact that the boy who used to chase after other people's arguments had grown into the man who nearly caused one of his own, and had at least had the sense, in the end, to stop chasing it before it cost him everything worth keeping. Wyatt stayed on past that reckoning, first to help his brother through the difficult season of admitting what the ranch could and couldn't sustain without a Josephine-shaped solution attached to it. And then, gradually, because leaving no longer felt like the only available shape his life could take, he told me, one evening at the headgate we had rebuilt together, that he had spent 6 years believing the only way to avoid becoming his father's ledger entry was to belong to no one and no land at all, and that it had taken watching his own brother nearly repeat their father's exact mistake to understand the actual lesson had never been about avoiding attachment in the first place, only about choosing it honestly instead of having it chosen for him. I told him I understood something of that particular arithmetic myself. He reached for my hand then, mud-stained and work-roughened as it was, and this time nothing interrupted what he'd been trying to say to me since that laughing morning in July, and he said it plain, the way he said everything, that he had ridden away from one kind of belonging 6 years ago and had not expected, riding back, to find another kind waiting for him at a fence line he'd once tried very hard to forget existed. By the following spring, Daniel had taken to riding over most Sundays with no ledger in hand at all, just his own company offered plainly, sitting on my porch some evenings long enough to talk about nothing more consequential than the weather or the state of the upper pasture, and I came to understand that particular ordinariness is the truest kind of amends a careful man like him knew how to make. The 2 ranch wives from the general store found new gossip to embellish that season, as ranch wives generally do, and I noticed they had quietly stopped asking, whenever I came to town, which Calloway brother I intended to settle matters with, as though the whole territory had simply absorbed the answer without requiring me to announce it formally. Daniel courted a schoolteacher from the next county over that same spring, a woman named Grace who had no land and no ditch and, as far as I could tell, no interest whatsoever in his ledgers, and I watched him bring her to a barn dance that June, looking less like a man doing careful sums, and more like one who had simply decided, for once, to enjoy his own company without accounting for what it might yield him. He thanked me once, awkwardly, for what he called making him a better bookkeeper of his own conscience, which was as close as Daniel Calloway was ever likely to come to poetry, and I told him I hadn't done anything except refuse to be one of his columns, which had apparently been instruction enough. We proved up the claim together the following spring, my name and eventually his standing on the deed the government finally recognized as fully earned, and I still kept my father's boots by the door long after that. Though I no longer found myself talking to them quite so often, because most of the questions I used to ask them had answers now. Standing beside me at the headgate most mornings with mud past his wrist, the water never once cared whose name was on the deed. It only ever cared whose hands showed up to tend it, morning after morning, without being asked twice.